Hey everyone, this is just a quick demo extending our work with measurement to show you how to do some data analysis. And just to remind ourselves of what we're dealing with here, we developed a tool to measure socio-political orientation. We went through a process of conceptualization where you all thought of the images that came to mind of a liberal and conservative person. You then decided if those categorized into dimensions, and then came up with some statements that people could rate in terms of the strength they agree with or not, and that those could be used as a part of a tool to measure this overarching concept of socio-political orientation. So we said that it was the combination of a person's attitudes and beliefs about social responsibility and ethics, individual freedom, accountability, and justice, change and tradition, fiscal and economic responsibility, national identity and security, and trust in government and authority. So, in your individual groups, you may not have come up with all of these ideas, but as a collective, this is what we came up with. Now, we then turned it into an operational definition. Now, this was the rules for how we were going to generate data. So, we said that we were going to have our participants, people who take our questionnaire, rate a series of attitude and belief statements using a 6-point Likert scale. So one would equal strongly agree, strongly disagree, six would equal strongly agree. Then we specified the rules for how to get a score out of those ratings, a single score that we could then use to do analysis with. So the first step we said was you needed to reverse score all of the conservatively worded statements, things that you would, if you agreed with, you would be more conservative. We had to reverse score those so that they were on the same scale as the liberal statements, so that if you agree, you're more liberal. We reverse score them so that we could take an overall average. So if we reverse score all the conservative statements, then they're on the same scale. I can either add them up or I can take the average. In this case, I'm going to take the average of all the ratings. So if I take the average of all the ratings of all the statements a person rates, I get a single score that ranges between 1 and 6, where a 6 would be an indication of a more liberal oriented person, and a 1 would be indication of a lower, of a more conservative oriented person. So everyone will get a score between 1 and 6. It'll be like 3.28 or 4.79. And that will place them on this scale from 1 to 6. These anchors will give you a sense of where they are on the continuum. So if you see a 3.5, they're very much in the middle overall. If you see a 4.9, they're approaching, agree and getting closer to potentially strongly agree. So that's how we can understand what the numbers mean. Now, I also went through a process, and I didn't specify it here, but calculating the averages for the subdimensions. So there's 15 questions in the first subdimension, 7 in the second, and then 4 in a couple of the others. By having those averages, I can do some work to see if our, the way we set up our nominal definition actually is valid. Is there evidence that there are these unique dimensions? And I'll show you how we can assess that. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to try to run a series of analyses to generate validity evidence that supports these expectations. So we expect that our tool should be reliable. It should have be something that will produce consistent results. And there's an analysis we can do to assess that. There's a single number that we can generate that will tell us how reliable our tool is. And I'll talk more about that when we do the analysis. Then we also said that the scores from our tools should not correlate with a few things: handedness, Barbenheimer preference, phone preference. So it should not correlate, and it should negatively correlate with things like age. Um, it would also show higher scores for females compared to males, and a series of other expectations if it actually is measuring what we collectively agree is socio-political orientation. Maybe the biggest one would be that people with the highest scores should be intending to vote Liberal or NDP compared to conservative in an upcoming election. So we have all these expectations and we're going to assess them. So what is our steps? We're going to prepare the data, reverse score those items I talked about that are conservatively oriented. Then I'm going to label them so they're they're in the right dimensions. I'm going to calculate dimension score, the overall average for each dimension, and I'm going to calculate the overall score average. Then I'll look at reliability, and I'll talk about a little something called item analysis, where we can maybe look at statements that are not working the way we thought they would. And then we'll look at how the dimension scores correlate. So every person is going to have an average score for each of those subdimensions. Now we can start to look at how those subdimension scores relate to one another. Oh, geez. And finally, we'll test our validity hypotheses, our evidence hypotheses. Sorry about that. Okay, let's get right to it. So let's look at what the data looked like when it came out of our survey tool. So this is a program called SPSS. And what we're looking right now at is the data view. The data view, each row is a person's responses. And the columns are the individual variables. So column 1 here would be the statement 1, all the way down the list to statement 43. Then we had our age question. We had our gender question. We had our where a person lives question, preference for movies, and so on and so forth. At the end here, you can see I've calculated the overall average. So this person's average was close to a 6, so pretty liberal. This person's was around the middle, and you can see there's all different kinds of scores. So that's the overall average. That's the main thing we're going to be looking at. And then there's these subdimension scores. So we've got these subdimension scores. There's 6 of them, and we're going to use those as well. So I was going to show you in Excel how I reverse scored things, but let's just say if you ever need that done, send me an email. In SPSS, one other thing I wanted to show you though is that you can alternate between the numerical values and the actual label values. So, agree was supposed to be a 4, I think. Yeah, so or a 5. Yeah, agree would have been a 5. And you can see that the actual label values are there as well as the numerical values. That's the benefit of working in a statistical software application. Because in Excel or in a spreadsheet application like Google Sheets, you can't have both things connected at once. So you're often struggling to remember what each of these things is. Same thing with the other variables we had over here. You can actually see them. And the other benefit of working with a statistical software is you often get to, this is basically a code book. So for this variable, which was, I gave it a weird ID that indicates that it was a liberal statement and it's attached to the dimension social responsibility. But I also get to keep track of what a 1 means, what a 6 means, and all of those kinds of things. And then you also get to specify what type of variable it is. You may have read about the different types of data that we deal with. So ordinal data is ordered data. So scale scores, from 1 to 6 are ordered numbers. The difference between a 1 and a 2 isn't necessarily the same as the difference between a 4 and a 5, but they do have an order to them. We have some categorical variables we're dealing with, like gender. We have other categorical variables like preference for movie. I actually put the location that a person lives as an ordinal because it really was ordered in terms of density of population, so least dense to most dense. And so that one I labeled as ordinal. That might be up for question, but the last type would be the scale, so the continuous type data. And the implications of these are that you can do different types of analyses with different types of data. With scale data, you can do correlations. With categorical data, you have to look at differences in means. So nominal is another word for categorical. So with categorical data, we have to look at differences in means. With ordinal data, we cannot do, we can't assume that 0 means the absence of something. and we are limited in terms of some of the statistics we could do. We're more likely to be doing non uh, non inferential statistics, more like looking at means, similar to categorical. So the first thing I wanted to do was assess the reliability. So the way you do that is you go to something called a scale analysis, reliability analysis, and you just throw all of your items over into into this box here. Gave it a label. I asked for some statistics, but we don't need to look at those right now. I'm just going to show you what you get from this analysis. So the first number, and really it is the most, the number that we're looking at is the reliability statistic. So you may have read that a reliability ranges between 0 and 1. Closer to 1, the more reliable. Now, we asked 43 questions. The other concept I think you may have learned is that the more questions you ask, as long as they're related to one another, the better chance of having good reliability. Well, we have a really reliable instrument. Overall scores, very consistent. But we had 43 items, so I'm sure there are some in there that are not working well. Now, I'm skipping over this set of descriptive statistics. All this is saying is the mean score for this question was 4.03. The mean score for this statement, which was universal income to support healthy quality of life, would benefit society as a whole, was only 3.9. So those are the descriptives. We don't really want to look at those right now. What I want to draw your attention to is something. This is what you do for an item analysis. So there's two things to look at. For this statement, which was we need more government intervention to address the problems facing society. The correlation between the scores on this one question and the rest of the rest of the test, the rest of the questionnaire is 0.583. That's a positive correlation. So that's a question that fits with everything. It's positively correlated. It's doing what it's supposed to do. If we were to remove that item, the Cronbach's alpha, the reliability index that was 0.924 above, actually goes down. So we don't want to remove it. Higher reliability is better, right? So basically that's your basis for looking for bad items. If you see a negative correlation like we do with this, it is important to minimize risks when making decisions that might result in change. So the fact that we're seeing a negative correlation means that, conservatives and liberals both might be agreeing with this or disagreeing with this, and having it as a part of our tool isn't really helping us. It's in fact making it less reliable. And so we might want to get rid of that. I'm not going to get rid of it. I just want to point out that this is how you diagnose whether a question is good or not. And we have one, that was the first one that has a negative. I think there's one more. Yeah, there's one. This isn't really a negative correlation. It's more like a zero correlation. Correlations range between -1 and 1, by the way. And so this one is not really adding anything. It's slightly negative. This one's pretty strongly negative, so removing it probably also valid. Individuals should have the autonomy to make choices about their own lives without others' interference. So liberals and conservatives don't seem to disagree on this. And it doesn't correlate with the rest of the items. So there's a few in here. When you have a 43 item questionnaire, not all of your questions are going to work the way you think they would. So, but in large part they did, and we have a really strong tool in terms of what we've defined it as. These will produce consistent numbers. If we erase everyone's brain and ask them to write this, take this questionnaire again, they probably produce very similar results. So the next thing we wanted to do was look at the correlation between the dimensions. So, oops, I did not want to do that. We're going to do simply the correlations between each of the overall average scores that I calculated. So social responsibility and all the way down to trust in government. We'll throw those over there. I mentioned that correlations range between -1 and +1. All of these things should be positively correlated. So here's our value for the correlation between the social responsibility dimension and the change in tradition dimension. 0.492. It's moderately positive. It's about 0.5, which is right in the middle of the positive side of the correlation. So that's perfect. It's not measuring exactly the same thing, but it's measuring something that's somewhat related. Same thing with individual justice. A little bit more strongly correlated, which is starting to suggest it might be measuring the same thing, but it's still not perfect, and it still justifies being its own dimension. And this one's crossing over into being quite highly correlated. And so the correlation between social responsibility and financial economic responsibility is almost the same. So these two things maybe are overlapping too much. You go down the list though, and that's the highest one, and they all are moderately positively correlated. It's exactly what you want to see with dimensions. They're not close to zero. They're not negative. They're right in that middle positive correlation value. So then we would look at how attitudes and beliefs about change and tradition correlate with everything. And you see the same thing, this pattern of medium positive correlations. So across the board, didn't matter which dimension we were dealing with, the correlations are pretty much medium positive correlations, suggesting that our dimensional breakdown is justified. So they're their own things, but they're also really well related. So that brings us to, so we've got reliability. We've got a good justification for our nominal definition. Now let's look at our hypotheses about the correlation between overall score and age. So let's get rid of these and we'll throw overall score in here and we'll go find that age variable, which is right here. Throw it over, calculate the correlation. Now it should be negative, right? We said that high scores would be liberal, low scores would be conservative. So the older you are, the lower your score should be. This is a negative correlation, but it's not that negative. So that makes me wonder, well, what is the distribution of our ages? I thought I'd see a stronger correlation here. So I'm going to go look at what the age variable looks like. And this is how you understand whether your data is normally distributed or not, which is kind of what you need in order to do a lot of these analysis. If you take statistics, you'll hear, oh, is it normally distributed? Does it meet the assumption of normality? Well, that's just assessing whether it looks like a bell curve. And you can see with our age data, yeah, we don't quite match a bell curve. Like there's too many people in this age category, too many people in this age, not enough people in this age category to match what a bell curve is. So we have more people in this age group than we do in the younger age group categories. And we have maybe an overabundance of older individuals. And then also our sampling strategy might not be representative. So we might be dealing, I had mentioned, because we are who we are and where we are together as a group, we might be connected to a certain type of older people that isn't more generally available in wider society. Anyways, it's still negative. So it's still meeting the hypothesis. So we're good. It's not as negative as maybe we might thought we would see. That could also be the problem of our tool. We might be measuring things that aren't sensitive to age, which, it's something to dig into deeper. All right, so lastly, we're just going to look at the means for all those other preference-based variables and see if they match our expectations. So I asked SPSS, I wanted to look at the means for the overall scores for each of these different predictor variables. So let's open it up and see what we get. All right, so this first table is just telling you how many cases we had for each analysis. So nothing to look at here. The first variable, the most important one, how are you going to vote? So the average score, we had 35 individuals who said they were going to vote conservative. For them was 3.37. The average score for the Liberal or the NDPs were 4.37 and 4.52. I haven't done a statistical test, like a t-test, that compares these means to understand if they are statistically significant in terms of their difference. But the pattern matches our expectation. And I don't want to get into that level of detail of how to do that analysis, but the pattern does seem to align with what we were expecting. Now, the fact that there's only two people who indicated the Green Party and their scores are what they are, this isn't a very accurate estimate of what the average would be for a bunch of people from the Green Party. But these other ones where we have 30 or 25 people about are probably pretty accurate. So then you look at level of education. Level of education, the higher your level of education, the more liberal your score should be. And it looks like yeah, it looks like graduate degree or more is not quite as high as post-secondary or undergraduate degree. So this matches up, but generally, less education is looking like it has lower scores. This is not like the difference between post-secondary diploma versus some post-secondary. What is the order that we would expect? Generally, though, having post-secondary without compared to not having post-secondary is showing the difference we would expect. Um, then we look at social media preference. I did expect Facebook to have the lower of the scores between Facebook and Instagram. Instagram's more for younger people, which is where I was saying that social media preference is basically an indirect measure of age in some ways. So this does sort of match my expectation. I didn't expect there to be a difference based on coffee preference, and the fact that this is a 3 and this is a 4 isn't really meaningful. If you round this to the nearest whole number, you'll see that they're both 4. So really, there is no significant difference here. Gender, we are seeing the pattern we expect, and this is likely significant. We have enough people in each category, although our sample is clearly biased towards females. So that is probably affecting some of our results that we're seeing. We have more females than males. We were expecting remote to have the lowest scores and urban to have the highest scores, and we don't see that. But then you look at the number of people who were in remote locations, and we only had 2. So this isn't a very accurate estimate. But if we look at rural compared to urban, we are starting to see the pattern that we would expect. And not sure that this is significantly different given there's only 16, but it is the right pattern. Barbie, more liberal. Oppenheimer, less liberal. That is the pattern I was expecting to see. And even though it was in the not correlate, I secretly did expect to see this, and it's pretty strong difference. So interesting to see that. Handedness, nope, round these to the nearest whole number. There's really no difference. That's great. Shouldn't correlate. There's a little difficulty here because we only had 13 left-handed people. And then iPhone preference. I don't know. This one looks like it might be significant. Probably not though. It's borderline. It's basically 4.1 to 4.0. So no, I don't think that's significantly different. And then lastly, CBC News. I did expect to see CBC News with the higher, more liberal audience, and then the other two to be lower. So yeah, that's the demo. We've gotten through all the evidence, and we looked at reliability, and it was just sort of an entry point into that analysis piece. But also really cool to see that the tool we developed, there's a lot of signs that it's measuring what we thought it was measuring, and probably picking up on a big chunk of what socio-political orientation actually is. Not saying it's picking up on everything, but it is a tool that if we were transparent about how we developed it and used it in research, that I think people would, accept that it was a valid measure of this version of political orientation anyways. I loved having you folks in the class all term, and I hope this demo was fun, and even though it was way too long.